Hi everyone and welcome to my channel Karoline Snits. My name is Karoline and I live in Scotland with my husband Ben and our dog Fela, who's at the end of the bed. I'm originally Danish but I've lived in Scotland for the past 8 years now. Fela is joining me for now. Let's see if she gets tired of listening to me speak. Sometimes she does. It's always hard to know when she's had enough of being a part of the podcast or part of my videos. And second of all, Ben is home. It is Friday evening, so sometimes you might hear him from downstairs, but I'm really keen to put out some videos here in January. After all the Vlogmas, I just feel like I want to make sure I get some content out this month, and I actually had something else planned originally, and I started filming it earlier, but I think I need to sit on the format a little bit longer. And then I was kind of thinking, what is something I'd quite like to speak about? And this isn't actually something I had planned for this month, but it is something I get asked about or have like discussions with people about from time to time. And so I thought I would share my plans. I have prepared myself, made some notes. The dog is already tired of being in here, so for the first point, I'll let her out. But today I really wanted to talk about podcast making as we go into a new year. I'm sure many of you have like thoughts and maybe dreams, aspirations, those kind of things of what you want to do in the new year. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of you who watch podcasts, maybe you're thinking about trying it yourself. I think it's always important to give all the caveats at the beginning. First of all, I'm obviously no expert. You can find people with 10 times as many subscribers as me, if not more, on YouTube, especially even within knitting. But I still think it's something as a community that's always good to talk about. If any of you watching have made your own podcasts and have different thoughts or feelings, experiences, extra tips, all of that, I always think it's really useful to leave it in the comments. And similar to when I made the video about why I don't want to be a designer, I am always open to constructive disagreement if you feel differently about some of these things, but let's get on with it anyway. My first point is be aware that you may not grow that quickly. I think something I hear often is when people start a podcast, it can be really slow to take off. For some people, it's like they put up their first video and they immediately have, like 1,000 subscribers by their second video. And often I think you see that because I'm sure the algorithm, for whatever reason, favors that videos to show to someone else. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that there's plenty of people making beautiful content that isn't getting that kind of traction, and maybe it'll take time and maybe it never will. And so I think the first thing is that you have to kind of accept the fact that in any of these things, sometimes it does feel like a popularity contest, and it's always really uncomfortable when you feel like you are not winning that game, I guess. And in complete honesty, in my own experience, it took months before I really had any substantial subscriber base. And even now, I grow very, very slowly and haven't actually grown all that much. I'm fairly certain I started 2022 with about 5,000 subscribers, and I've just hit 6,000 subscribers last time I checked. And you will find people who've done it shorter than me and have more subscribers. And you know what? Sometimes it can feel like, what do I not have that other people have? And so I think you need a certain level of robustness in how you approach it, because otherwise all the fun disappears if it immediately becomes, how do I grow? How do I get bigger? What can I do better all the time? It's also easy to feel like you're always coming up short. I also think something that I have thought a lot about is that I definitely think even from when I started my podcast to now, the whole community has changed quite a lot. When I first began, there was definitely other knitting podcasts, but I feel like there's a lot more of them now, and sometimes that makes it harder as well because there's more choice and people might have more specific preferences than you know, it might be because there's more choice, people can have more preferences in who they choose to follow over someone else. And I really feel for many of the newer creators, because I'm not sure I would have made it to the size today, even if it is still in relative terms probably quite a small size, if it wasn't because I started the podcast in 2020. And I just think it's such an important thing to talk about, because people always celebrate their successes and very few people will celebrate these kind of failures, I guess, or at least mention them. And all I can say is I don't always see a big rhyme and reason in who makes it big and who doesn't. And I don't think there's a true winning formula to it. But I do think as the market grows, I think the bar for doing well increases as well. And so there might be more demands on sort of what kind of content you should offer. And sometimes it also makes it harder to really think of original things as well. And I guess sometimes well, at least I have certainly picked a formula that I think works for me, suits who I am, what kind of content I enjoy creating, and not just the type of content I enjoy watching, for example. I've spoken about it before, but obviously I'm very good friends with the lovely Laura from Penrose Knits, and I absolutely love her vlogs. I really respect the content and creativity that goes into it. And when I tried it, I just realised that for me, it was a really unnatural content creation form for me. It just didn't suit me as a person. And I don't know if I'm just not good enough at romanticising life. I feel like at the moment, social media is very much about that kind of romanticising your life and all of these things. And it's just not something everyone's perfect at. And that's okay too. But it's basically to say that there's not a necessary rhyme or reason as to why some people make it and some people don't. And you need to kind of, I think before even beginning, kind of make it clear to yourself, because something I never think comes across well is if you're really upset about not growing, it can come across in your content. And if you do feel, and I have certainly been there as well, that if you feel like you have nothing good to say or show, sometimes it's better to wait to release the next video. Second of all, I think there's some technical things. Many of the next points are going to be about technical things. So in my day-to-day life, I am not a content creator, but I work with people who are, and sometimes we discuss this at work, because I basically decided that you know, what I do as a hobby isn't anything worthwhile being secretive about, but it certainly is something I'd rather people kind of know exist and hide it. And so it's become a bit of a running joke at work about my sort of knitting alter ego here on YouTube. But with that, there's some technical things if you're getting started. And as I said earlier, you know, if you don't want people to not watch your podcast because there's some technical things that are fairly easy to fix, that you haven't fixed. So the first one is, what do you film on? I have recently gotten that question because I recently upgraded what I film on, and it might surprise you to hear I did not buy a camera. I bought a new phone. I film on an iPhone 14 Pro Max. I have always, as soon as they came out with the biggest iPhones, that's always been my go-to. So it's no surprise it's the big phone, but especially now with the cinematic mode, I honestly think the content is really, really good, and you get a lot of benefits with filming on a phone or similar device, in that the files are usually easier to work with than like a massive camera. And my dad is a professional photographer. I actually own a DSLR, and all I can say is that they're not all created equal. Mine can certainly do video, but it isn't brilliant at it. It would struggle. If I set it up here right now, you would not get this level of quality easily, probably because I'm not as proficient at it, but also because the focus wouldn't be as good as my phone can manage. And often that makes it just so much easier. Personally, I never use portrait mode. I'm sure the portrait camera in my phone is fine for sort of everyday selfies kind of use. But personally, I think on video, it's better not to. Sometimes that does have the disadvantage that you can't easily see yourself. So if I can, I sometimes prop my phone. Right now you are in front of a mirror, and that means I can at least kind of see what's the general framing of me. Does things look generally okay? But I might have lipstick on my teeth this whole video and I will have no idea till I'm editing it. And I think even prior to this, I filmed on my previous phone, but honestly, you know, as much as this is maybe a step up in quality, most phones that are, you know, 4 years old and newer probably would be more than fine. And to be honest, probably even older than that. I've also seen people film on their webcams, and sometimes if you have something else to offer, the video quality matters less. I think for knitting podcasts, depending on what type of podcast you have or videos that you make, sometimes quality matters more and sometimes it matters less. So if you're like me and most of your content is, you know, sitting down, showing things off every once in a while, you can really work around not having the best quality by just doing simple things such as, you know, I have BRoll of me trying the content on because of my content, trying on my knits, because even if it's not perfect studio quality, it still gives an idea of how a garment looks, but it kind of saves me the faff of, is it showing up well enough when I'm just sat like this? So that's my first recommendation, to really think about something that you already have. And I think that leads me to point number 3, which is it's actually much more important how and where you film. So obviously this is probably as unideal as it gets. I always get comments that people don't like the glare, and I do apologize. I am basically blind as a mole without my glasses, so without my glasses it feels really insane to film. So I do wear glasses. If you weren't wearing glasses, I'm sure the glare of this wouldn't really matter. I use makeup lights because they are, you know, they still give that kind of brightness, and light really matters in video. In an ideal world, I'd always film in, you know, in front of a window or a natural light source if at all possible. And that's what I try to do when it's not, you know, the deepest, darkest, coldest winter, if possible, with a normal phone, not being like having lighting sort of a lighting source in front of you. I wouldn't film with a window in the background because it can create, basically because the background will be much brighter than you will become quite dark. And I always find that quite distracting to watch. Same for where you film. I find this hard, and I've spoken about it many times in my podcast. I don't live in some, you know, I live in a new build. My house is nothing but small rooms and bright white walls, and let's be real, it isn't the prettiest scenery at all times. But I do try to pick backgrounds that are not too distracting. You know, I don't film in front of a lot of mess if I can help it. I'd much rather film in a background that maybe isn't as pleasing in order for it not to be distracting than, for example, when I've tried to film in my living room facing, I have like an all-in-one, you know, kitchen, living room, diner kind of situation. And when I film down there, I've always found that actually the kitchen in the background can feel quite distracting. So I always try to pick somewhere that is kind of plain. I do think people are really good sometimes at picking backgrounds that are prettier, you know, have a little candle burning and some greenery. But I do also think the framing of you is important. If you are filming, you want to be as straight on as you can. You want to have just enough white space, but not too much. And again, the danger of filming on something like a webcam is that if the laptop is angled wrong, you just look up someone's nostrils. You know, it's easier to film if it's facing you straight. When it comes to tripods, I use a tripod for my camera. I do not understand people who, you know, manage with the whole leaning on things forever. Not for me. I love my tripods. I also use it for taking normal photographs of myself because I try my best on Instagram to share photos of knits on, and it's so much easier with a tripod. Now, I own 2 different kinds. When I first started filming, I used what you are currently on, which is the cheapest, like Gorilla, so like the legs are bendable kind of tripod. It's about this tall, and it has essentially just a phone attachment where you slide the phone in. Mine even came with a little clicker remote, which you can use for photos or for starting the video if you so wish. But I also have an Amazon basic tripod that, you know, the phone attachment from the original tripod attaches to, and that gives me more flexibility depending on where I film, especially when I film facing that window behind me in daylight. I find sometimes the standing tripod is actually better for getting the best angle than this little one. But I personally, hats off to people who get normal angles without a tripod. I do not know how you do it, and they really don't have to be very expensive or fancy, especially if you're not taking them places or putting a really heavy DSLR on it. Now, personally, I have definitely found this a learning curve before I started filming podcast. This is point number 4. We're talking about editing. Before I started filming podcast, I'd used iMovie a bit at work, and I knew the very bare bones of how it worked and how to manipulate, how to do certain things like cut things, etc. But I've definitely had to learn more now that I'm filming podcasts. And to be honest, I think it's a hard thing because I definitely also know people who edit much better than me. But I try to do at least some basic editing. Everyone sometimes says things not as neatly as they'd like, or the doorbell rings, or the dog faffs about, or I get distracted or whatever, and I try to cut out those gaps. I am really prone to saying oh, and so kind of noises, and sometimes I try to cut them out and sometimes I leave them in. If you can see I did just that. If you look back at some of my very first videos, I'm fairly certain I cut out too many. And I remember a commenter who said, your videos really, I really enjoy your content, but you've way too many cuts in this. And that kind of constructive criticism can sometimes be useful, because when you watch your own videos, it's hard to be as critical about the content that you're making, I think, than people watching. So basic editing, I think, is always a good way to go. I personally find, being a non-native speaker, it's always useful to have names on screen. So like whatever garment you're making, or maybe even the yarns, those kind of things, have titles for that. And I know some of my friends, I don't know if Laura still does it, but I know in the past, for example, she used Canva to create fancy ones. Now I think it's a bigger time investment than people watching videos may realize to make them. It can take a long time. First of all, there's like the planning, the setting up, and then the filming itself. Sometimes you film once and for whatever reason you might not be. Sometimes I've filmed and I don't feel happy with how I phrase things or how I came across, or I don't feel like it was exactly what I wanted to say, so I film again. I've had a few times where like the footage was weird, and so I filmed again. And then you come to the editing stage, and at this stage I try to keep it as efficient, because everything is a time sucker. If you want it to be, the filming can take triple as long as I spend. If you take lots and lots of pretty shots that you need to embed in, or lots of extra video, same, all those kind of added bits into the video itself. And the same with editing. If you have lots of like fancy titles floating about and all of these things, it can take a lot longer. So I am basic, and I just pick standard titles in iMovie, or have so far. If you are not a MacBook user or have an Apple product, because you can also edit on iPads. I grew up, I was going to say, but I learned on not a desktop, but on a laptop, and so I find it much easier than on the iPad or even on the phone, but theoretically you could. There's also, you might have heard of Adobe before. They make things like Photoshop. They also have an editing software called Premiere Pro, which is like, your professional editing software. Now, I could not figure that tool out for life. So I wouldn't recommend it if you've never edited anything and you're not particularly interested in the editing part. Some people find that the most enjoyable aspect, and you might want to learn for whatever reason. I do find it's always useful. Like, I find that making these videos keep me on top of like my presentation skills and talking skills and editing skills and all these other things, but it might not for everyone. So they also make a product called Premiere Pro Rush, and the Rush part is really important. It also comes on, you can also use it on your iPad and on your phone. It's Windows compatible and all of those things, and I think there's a limit to how many files you can export off your iPad per month or something, but it is still fairly affordable. And it is really very easy to pick up for most people. It's very much like iMovie, and so it does the basics really well. If you want to do fancy graphics on top of everything, really complicated color grading, it's probably not for you. But those are kind of my entry levels. I recently bought a new laptop, and I'm hoping to learn Final Cut Pro, which is kind of the Apple's upgrade, you could say, to iMovie, that is much more complicated and can do a lot more things. And so far I just filmed what I made in 2022, and that's edited in Final Cut Pro, and I'm sure if people watch it they cannot tell that I used a more fancy software. but I'm doing it for me. So all of those things are different editing options. I am sure that there's also free editing softwares other places available on mobile phones or tablets, etc. But I'm not aware of any other ones, but I feel like with the growth of things like TikTok and Reels, etc., I feel like you can find other sort of apps that do similar things if you so desire. But I do think basic editing to some extent, even if it's just cutting out awkward bits at the start and the end, it can make a really big difference. I do watch a podcast and the person doesn't edit anything, and I like the content so much that I watch everything. But it's probably still one of the things that can make me choose to stay or not if I feel like there's a lot of faff in the background constantly. My fifth point is to stay active. So obviously I've already done the whole like don't be discouraged if you don't get 10,000 subscribers overnight. But I think in that there's also something about staying active in the community as a whole. Personally, I think it was easier for me when I started a podcast because to begin with, I'm sure viewers came from Instagram. I probably had about 1,000 followers, and actually when I hit about 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, I've always had more subscribers than I've had followers on Instagram. I don't know why, and I'm not sure if it's the same for everyone. But that's how it's worked out for me. But I think a big part of it is to stay active in general. So obviously the more you can stay on top of comments, the better. For that, I personally really try my hardest. Sometimes I do fall behind, especially on older videos. But I use a YouTube app called YouTube Studio, and it basically allows you on your phone to have like a long, and on your laptop, etc. But what YouTube Studio gives you on your phone, on the app, is that it shows you all your latest comments, and it makes it so much easier to see what's come in and reply to it as you go. And I find staying on top of it is really important. Also because if people have taken the time and effort to comment on your videos, I think it's always nice to give some kind of recognition that you've seen it or have commented back. I also think there's something about staying active in the community. You will probably, if you watch my videos or my friends' videos, you'll probably know who I'm knitting friends with. And I think in general, staying active with other things will make life easier. I don't think a cold message to say to someone, can you give a shout out to my videos, is the way to go. Especially if you don't have a relationship with someone and you don't watch the videos, it can feel kind of weird in general to be asked. But if you're good friends with someone, often you'll naturally come up in conversation, and I definitely do notice that people come my way when I've come up in other contexts for whatever reason. And I also think staying active in the community sometimes gives you a reminder of why you're doing it in the first place. So whether that's watching other people, sometimes it's a negative thing because you then also, comparison is the kill of all joy kind of thing. But I do think it's an important part of having a podcast. And also, if you do have an Instagram, I think if people feel like they know you, certainly that's something I am really conscious of, because that's the kind of person I want to portray, is that you do know, obviously, bits that I choose to put online, etc. But you will see big parts of my life, and obviously the big parts of my life are knitting and the dog, who has forsaken me just now. But those are usually aspects that come up both on Instagram and on YouTube, and so I find it nice to be able to share that in general. The sixth one is BRoll. I found this one really interesting because I do think the sort of like entry-level videos now have become so much more complex than when I first began, and what my videos are like still. I definitely think this is one I don't have the correct answer to, because in a lot of ways I've kind of opted out of it, and I'm also conscious that if I did more of it, it might mean more growth because more people would like it, I guess. But BRoll is definitely one that you can look into. I, for example, like how often Well Loved Knits, who is a much bigger channel than me, she often includes like pretty shots of her knitting. Some people quite enjoy including clips of things they've done, almost vlog style, like, to have like clips of them going for walks certain places, or all of those things. And if you feel like they add something to your video, certainly you can go for it. I guess I'm also trying to legitimize if you also think it's a lot of work, because I certainly do, but the option is there if you want it. I guess the main type of B-roll that I make is that I try on my garments. So when I've finished a garment, I almost always, if possible, include a try on shot of it, because I think it's always much easier to see what a finished product looks like if you're actually seeing it on a body. And over time, I've discovered that I often get much better feel for what people have made if you see it on. And so that is actually something I find quite important in podcasts that I decide to subscribe to and watch. Also because as much as it's not a, I know high fiber knits have talked about it, the whole like, you know, if you, some people can find it triggering to hear like, okay, I'm this exact measurement and this exact size and this is what I weigh and this is how tall I am kind of thing. So while I may not, I personally would also feel uncomfortable sharing all of those numbers about myself, as much as I'm not very secretive, but I do try to give a general idea of this is what my body is like. Also because then it's much easier to talk about the fit of a garment, and that is one benefit that I see to podcasts that you don't get in an Instagram post, is someone being able to say, oh, I needed to add quite a lot of sleeve length because the sleeves are way too short or whatever, those type of things. Seventh, and this is kind of my final point, and I'd be really interested to hear from people watching and from other podcasters, but I think a final thing that is really hard to give a formula to is authenticity. You know what I'm trying to say, being authentic. Because that is, I think, a big part of it. It's like you need to ask yourself the question of what do you bring, right? Why do you feel like you making a video is useful? And I think it's something that's important to keep in mind, because it can be easy to lose track of with all of these other things. You know, it can feel like quite a set process at times. And I think for some it's about record keeping. They quite like, you know, this is exactly how much I've done. Some people really enjoy the comments more than anything. Some people, probably me included, quite like the sound of their own voice and a platform to talk about knitting without being interrupted. But it's important to think, what do you bring that you don't feel like is somewhere else? And I also think it's an important question to ask yourself, not in like a way to discourage yourself, but just to find purpose with what you're doing. And then it's also, I think, longer term about thinking about what makes people stick around with you. Like, what do you think that people like about your videos, and are there anything they don't like? So for me, it's always to find balance with Fela, because as much as I love other knitting podcasts to have their dog in them, I also know there's a fine balance between a tiny bit of dog interruption being cute and loads of dog interruptions being a little bit annoying. So there's some of that. And then it's also about thinking about, do people stick around for your honesty? Do they stick around because you make patterns that no one else has made? I find something that always makes me sad is when I watch people's knitting videos and they're like, oh yes, well, I've just made another petite knit pattern and I know it's really unoriginal and it's beige, I'm so sorry. And you know what, if that's what you like to make, then feel proud of it. Don't be apologetic for what you bring. If you really like knitting petite knit, you know what, own it. You're not the only one. There's a reason why she's so big and popular. My top search terms and how people seem to stumble across me is petite knit, so I'm sure if I made more petite knit knits, I might be even bigger, who knows? So don't think of it necessarily as a negative, but maybe people stick around because they like the fact that when petite knit releases a new sweater, you're one of the first ones to make it. Maybe you really like your yarn substitutions, your yarn colours. If you think of someone like Arrow Knits and Pearls, that's really hard in my accent. You know, she knits, for example, basically exclusive and hand-dyed yarn, and I always really like to see what colours she chooses and how a pattern looks in something hand-dyed, because that's maybe different than most of my knits, which are commercial yarns. Maybe you buy loads and loads of yarn and you love to show acquisitions, nothing wrong with that. Maybe you like to tell long-winded stories. All of these things are like things that might draw people to stick with you over someone else, or that sounded a bit rude, but I hope you know where I'm coming from. Basically, it's that, what do you think people like about you? And I find that important to remind myself sometimes when I've had a lull. And I think in authenticity, there's also something about accepting that sometimes you have content and sometimes you don't. Recently I've been working on a project that has taken up so much more of my knitting time than I first expected, that, to be honest, I might not do a normal podcast episode in January because I don't know if I'll have much to show for it, because you know, this project has carried across 3 different podcasts at that point, and it's maybe a bit much if it's still whipped by the 4th kind of thing. So all of those are important things, and it's okay to try to be a certain level of active, but don't force content for the sake of it just because you have to. The joy of the knitting community is that I actually don't always think that releasing more content helps you, and it's only something I have noticed. It's almost like if people see you in the subscription box too often, I don't know if you become irrelevant, or if it's like, oh well, I've seen Karoline's face recently, I don't want to see her again kind of thing. But I do notice in my numbers that if things are too close together, then people don't seem to watch it as quickly. I also noticed that even videos that haven't, you know, that aren't very recent still get watched, which I don't know if it's specific to a knitting community. I've never had a YouTube channel showing anything else, but I do find it interesting that content can actually carry itself for quite a long time. So putting things out there when you feel like it's the right time to do it is much better. Now, I always go backwards and forwards if I've found a perfect format. And sometimes I think reflections about what you do and what you think is something I quite like to watch, and it's something I quite like to add. I personally hate, not hate, but I personally don't like podcasts that tip too much to either end. So like podcasts are all about, you know, knitting is no good, I'm not good at anything, nothing I create is good enough, everything is just like, I'm not big enough, I'm not good enough, the colours aren't right, nothing looks good on me, etc. But equally, it's also sometimes if you watch someone who every single project that they've made, they're just like, oh well, it was a bit of a challenge, but look, it's a pretty project, here's my next 10 ones. It can feel quite insincere in some way, and I think there's a balance there with honesty. And that's also why sometimes sponsored content for me, as I've spoken many a times, it can become really complex because you want a certain level of honesty about what you're making, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to slate things just for the sake of it to look real. And those were kind of my knitting podcast thoughts. I would honestly truly love to hear. I found when I made the video about why I don't want to be a knitwear designer, I found it really interesting to hear what people kind of think about it. And it was interesting because I had loads and loads of people say that they felt the same as me. And I also had some people who were like, well, all of this is true, yeah, I still love it and I still do it. I know quite a few knitwear designers, and well, they're still here, aren't they? So I'd love to know. So if you have any sort of thoughts and feelings on it, always much appreciated. I find that my favorite things about these videos is all the sort of comments and thoughts about it, more than just the echo chamber of what I've just talked about. So yes, that's all for today, and I hope you'll stick around for more content, but if not, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you again soon. Bye.